If I were the devil, if I were the devil, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness, and I'd have a third of its real estate and 4/5 of its population, but I wouldn't be happy until I had seized the ripest apple on the tree, thee. So I'd set about, however necessary, to take over the United States. I'd subvert the churches first. I'd begin with a campaign of whispers. With the wisdom of a serpent, I would whisper to you as I whispered to Eve, do as you please. To the young, I would whisper that the Bible is a myth. I would convince them that man created God instead of the other way around. I would confide that what's bad is good and what's good is square. And the old, I would teach to pray after me, Our Father, which art in Washington. And then I'd get organized. I'd educate authors in how to make lurid literature exciting so that anything else would appear dull and uninteresting. I'd threaten TV with dirtier movies and vice versa. I'd peddle narcotics to whom I could. I'd sell alcohol to ladies and gentlemen of distinction. I'd tranquilize the rest with pills. If I were the devil, I'd soon have families at war with themselves, churches at war with themselves, and nations at war with themselves, until each in its turn was consumed. And with promises of higher ratings, I'd have mesmerizing media fanning the flames. If I were the devil, I would encourage schools to refine young intellects, but neglect to discipline emotions. Just let those run wild. Until before you knew it, you'd have to have drug-sniffing dogs and metal detectors at every schoolhouse door. Within a decade, I'd have prisons overflowing. I'd have judges promoting pornography. Soon I could evict God from the courthouse, then from the schoolhouse, and then from the houses of Congress. And in his own churches, I would substitute psychology for religion and deify science. I would lure priests and pastors into misusing boys and girls and church money. If I were the devil, I'd make the symbol of Easter an egg and the symbol of Christmas a bottle. If I were the devil, I'd take from those who have and give to those who wanted until I had killed the incentive of the ambitious. And what'll you bet? I couldn't get whole states to promote gambling as the way to get rich. I would caution against extremes in hard work, in patriotism, in moral conduct. I would convince the young that marriage is old-fashioned, that swinging is more fun, that what you see on TV is the way to be. And thus I could undress you in public, and I could lure you into bed with diseases for which there is no cure. In other words, if I were the devil, I'd just keep right on doing what he's doing. Paul Harvey. Good day.
For those of you who are not familiar with Paul Harvey, he was a legendary figure in the radio business. From 1951 all the way until 2008, Paul Harvey spoke to an average of more than 20 million people a week as an American radio broadcaster for ABC News Radio. Now, the recording that you just heard was not recorded this week. It was not recorded this year. It was not even recorded in this century. That recording was made almost 60 years ago. And yet, when you listen to his words and his warnings, it almost sounds prophetic. You listen to those words and you think to yourself, how in the world could a man in 1965 speak so accurately and so precisely regarding what America would be like in 2023? The Bible has an answer for that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, the Apostle Paul wrote and said, "No temptation has seized you except what is common to a man." That's the Apostle Paul's way of saying that your spiritual enemy has a bag of tricks that he uses over and over and over again, because the tricks in his bag work over and over and over again. There's an old quote, a lot of you have heard it, it's been attributed to many different people, but it goes something like this: those who fail to learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. The reason that we are dealing with the same issues in 2023 that Paul Harvey was talking about all the way back in 1965 is because we're not learning from our history. Instead, we are repeating our history. The book of Proverbs talks about this very issue. In Proverbs chapter 26, verse 11, the wise man observed this: as a dog returns to its vomit, so fools repeat their folly. People just have a tendency to come back again and again and again to their folly or their foolish ways. Why? Because foolish people don't learn from their history. Instead, we repeat our history. And the truth of the matter is, we all do it. Same thing happened in Nehemiah's day. These people that God had been working in their lives in a great way, and a lot of ways they had been redeemed, they had been restored, they had been spiritually revived. But they didn't learn from their history, and so what we see at the end of the book is that they start to repeat their history all over again. About 150 years earlier, these people had turned their back on God, and so God said, if that's the way you want it, that's the way you'll have it. He removed his hand of blessing. He removed his hand of protection. The people were invaded by their enemies. They were taken into captivity where they lived for 140 years. After 140 years of that, I think God thought they've surely learned their lesson by now. And so God liberated his people, and a lot of the people started to make their way back to Jerusalem. There was a small remnant of people who still had their faith in God, and they still shared a great love for God. And so they joined Nehemiah in the holy city of God, the city of Jerusalem, and they started rebuilding the wall and rebuilding the city. Sure enough, a revival broke out. It's like these people had finally learned from their history. They had finally learned that the reason that they had suffered is because they had sinned. But now they've come back home. Now they've come back to God. Now they have confessed their sins. And they have determined in their heart, we are never going back to that life again, because we all know where that life leads. It'll take you down a dead-end road. It will take you to a place that you do not want to go. It will take you right back into some form of slavery all over again. And so now they're living in the city of Jerusalem. They're walking with God, and these were the good old days. God had forgiven them. God had changed them. They enjoyed being back home. They enjoyed being back in a right relationship with God. They enjoyed the great blessings of God. But then they did what most people do. They resorted back to their old ways. After only 12 years of the good life, they resorted back to their old life. Do you ever wonder why we do that? I mean, if you know how a behavior is going to make you feel, not just now, but also later, if you know what that behavior is going to do to your family, if you know what that behavior is going to do to you financially, if you know how that behavior is going to affect your soul, if you know that it's going to take you to a bad place and not to a good place, then why do you do it? Isn't this the very definition of insanity? You do the same old thing, but somehow you expect it to produce a different result. It's crazy, but the truth is we all do it. And so before we jump into the text today, I just want to ask you to think about your own personal history for a minute. When you look back over the history of your life, what mistakes did you make in the past that you do not want to repeat in the future? When you look back at the history of your life, what are the mistakes that you've made in the past that you do not want to make in the future? I imagine that we've all got at least a couple of things that are popping into our minds. Now, I want you to think beyond your own life. And now I want you to think about the history of your family. And so when you look back at the history of your family, we're not just talking about you, we're talking about things that your parents did. We're talking about things that their parents did. And you look back at the history of your family, what are the generational sin patterns that you need to break? But because if you don't break it, it's going to continue into another generation. Has every single marriage always ended in divorce? Has every single man in your family always committed adultery? Have the people in your family always struggled with gossip or greed or pride or anger? Have the people in your family struggled to love others because deep down inside you guys really think that you're better than others? Is there a pattern of drug abuse or alcohol abuse? That when you look back at the history of your family, there's always people who are in and out of rehab, or maybe there's even someone in your family who drank themselves to death. That's what we would call a generational sin pattern. It's a pretty serious problem that is continuing from one generation to the next generation, because there's never anyone who says, this sin will die with me and it will not continue with my family. Some scientists may even call these types of struggles that are rooted in what's known as a genetic predisposition. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But we all look at it and we say, this is a part of my family's history, as embarrassing as it is, and I do not want it to be a part of my family's future. You can look at that sin and you see that that sin has produced great suffering in both your life and in the life of your family. And now you don't want that sin to produce any more suffering for anyone that you love and care about. You look at it and you go, I do not want my kids to suffer with this. I do not want to see my grandkids suffering because of this. And so the question is, how do you change something like that? How? Do you break those patterns, not just in your life, but how do you break those patterns in your family? In Nehemiah's day, there were a few things that they struggled with over and over and over again, and it always ended in the same place. More sin always produced more suffering, and Nehemiah was sick and tired of it. He was sick and tired of seeing the sin. He was sick and tired of seeing the suffering, and so Nehemiah said, I'm going to do something about it. Now, when all of this went down, you need to know that Nehemiah was not in the city of Jerusalem. It's almost like he wants everybody to know it didn't happen on my watch, okay? It's like parents going out of town and the kids threw a party while they were out of town, not while they were in town, right? It's like going to work and the boss is on vacation for a couple of weeks, and so everybody's slacking off. In Nehemiah chapter 13, Nehemiah said there was a lot of stuff that was going down while I was out of the city of Jerusalem. I'll pick it up in Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. This is what we read. Before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, the musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. Now, when I read those two verses, I immediately have two questions. My first question is this: why in the world is Eliashib closely associated with someone like Tobiah. If you don't remember the name Tobiah, there was a guy named Tobiah, and he had a buddy named Sanballat, who earlier in the book that we've been studying now for a few months, they were working together as two men to do everything they could to oppose the work of God. They did not want Nehemiah to rebuild the wall. They did not want him to rebuild the city. And so they did everything they could to distract Nehemiah. Some days they tried to discourage Nehemiah. Some days they tried to discredit Nehemiah. They spread lies about Nehemiah. And there were even some days when they tried to intimidate the people who were working alongside of Nehemiah. And so these guys who have been doing everything they could to oppose the work of God, this man Tobiah has now been given a prominent place inside the very house of God. It would be like someone today who doesn't even believe in Jesus. They hate the people who worship Jesus. Somehow they become the pastor. Somehow they become a small group leader. Somehow they end up sitting on the board and making all kinds of decisions. Which leads me to my second question. Why was Tobiah using a room that was formerly used to store articles for the temple? Why is he camped out in a room that had been used to house offerings and tithes for the people who were leading worship in the temple? Why isn't that room full of tithes and articles and offerings and olive oil and wine and grains and all types of other things that were given to the priests, the Levites, and the musicians who would lead worship in the house of God? Nehemiah tells us in verses 10 and 11. He said, I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Remember, when these people first got out of slavery, they gave generously to God's work because they knew the importance of God's work. They had just spent the last 140 years not worshiping God, and they saw very clearly how that led to their rebellion against God. And so when they came back to God, they made giving to God a priority in their lives all over again. They said, man, we've got to fund the work of God so that we as a community stay right with God. The priests, the Levites, and the musicians would take care of everyone in the community spiritually, and then everyone in the community would take care of the priests, the Levites, and the musicians physically. You guys take care of all of our spiritual needs, and we're going to make sure that we take care of all of your physical needs. It was a perfect setup for everyone involved. But 12 years later, the people stopped giving, and they started neglecting the house of God all over again. These people had a real problem in that they didn't really know what to do with their money. The reason that that room is empty is because the people weren't giving anymore to support the work of God in their community. As a result of that, we're told that the Levites and the musicians, they had to move out. They went back home. They worked their own fields in order to provide for their own families. And when the Levites and the musicians moved out, Tobiah moved in. And so I really want you to understand what they did. They stopped supporting those who were doing the work of God, and they started supporting the man who had historically opposed the work of God. They didn't learn anything from their history. They didn't learn anything about the importance of giving to God's work in a particular community. They didn't learn anything about Tobiah. They didn't learn anything about the priority of worship. And because they didn't learn from their history, they are now repeating their history. Nehemiah notices that they have neglected the house of the Lord, but then he also notices that they neglected the Lord's day. Verses 15 to 18. In those days, I saw people in Judah treading winepress on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it onto donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all of this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day?" And then he asked them a very important question. He asked, "Didn't your ancestors do the same things, so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." It's like Nehemiah sees what's happening and goes, "Unbelievable. Here we go again. First, we're neglecting the Lord's house, and now we're neglecting the Lord's day." These people are making tragic mistakes because they're not committed to what they should be committed to. They don't know what to do with their money, and now it's pretty clear to Nehemiah that they don't know what to do with their time. And the truth is, Americans are not all that different all these years later. In 2022, surveys are out, 20% of Americans went to church every week. 21% of Americans went to church about every other week. And 57% of Americans said, "I never went to church," or "I only went to church on major holidays." Americans are struggling with what to do with their money, and they're struggling in how to honor God with their time. I don't know exactly what the stats were in Jerusalem, but I imagine that we're all in the same ballpark, right? That the Sabbath day for them was no longer a special day or a holy day. It was just another day. It was just another day to work, and it was just another day to make a dollar. There wasn't a day in their week that was set aside for rest and for worship. And so Nehemiah points out that the ancestors had done the exact same thing. And then he reminds them that because of that, they suffered as a nation in all kinds of ways. They didn't learn from their history. And so now they're repeating the history. This generational sin pattern is continuing. They neglected the Lord's house. They neglected the Lord's day. And now, because they haven't been worshiping God and they're not even listening to God, they're going to make some tragic mistakes in terms of how they handle their relationships and how they run their families. Verses 23 to 24, we see the relationship piece. We're told that moreover in those days, he said, "I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah." Nehemiah notices that these men are marrying women that they're not supposed to marry. That they're marrying women who don't worship their God, and they may even worship other gods. And on top of that, they are now raising a family, and they're raising children who don't know the language of Judah. Why is it important to know the language of Judah? If you don't know the language, then you'll never be able to read and understand the Scriptures. And if you can't read and understand the Scriptures, you'll never know who God is. You'll never know anything about God's ways, and you'll never know anything about the wonderful works that God has done. And so these kids are now growing up, and they are bound and determined to grow up never knowing God and never worshiping the one true God. This isn't the first time they've made that mistake as a nation. In fact, Nehemiah goes back and reminds them of their history. He tells them in verse 26, "Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned among the many nations? There was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. You can go back and you can read the entire story for yourself in 1 Kings chapter 11. Solomon started marrying women of other countries, and these women, they worshiped other gods. And because of that, he stopped worshiping his God, and instead, he started building temples so that they could go and worship their God, and he joined them in that practice. Now, you need to know that that type of behavior doesn't just affect a marriage and a man. That type of behavior will affect and ruin an entire generation. In fact, in Judges chapter 2, verse 10, again, part of their history, we're told that there was a day and a time when an entire generation grew up in Israel who did not know God or the great things that he had done for his people. In Nehemiah's day, they didn't learn from their history, and so now they are all repeating their history. Now, again, a lot of this happened while Nehemiah was out of town. If you look back in verse 6, Nehemiah said, "But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king." Now, Nehemiah was not in town. But were there other godly leaders who were in town? The answer is yes. There were priests who were in town, and there were Levites who were in town, and there were worship leaders, musicians who were also in town. But sadly, these leaders didn't have the courage of Nehemiah. And so they did what a lot of church leaders are doing in America today. They let things slide. They don't like confrontation. And so they take the path of least resistance and they do what is most comfortable for themselves rather than what is truly best for the people and for the nation. There are a lot of leaders in America who are just like that in the church today. Leaders who choose comfort over confrontation. Not Nehemiah. Nehemiah was sick and tired of seeing generational sin continue. He was sick and tired of seeing the suffering that it produced. And so when Nehemiah rolled back into town, and when Nehemiah saw what was going on, Nehemiah got angry, and Nehemiah took action. And so let me just pause right here and tell you that if you really want to change your life, if you really want to kill generational sin in your lifetime, if you really want to change your legacy, then you need a man like Nehemiah in your life. Nehemiah is not playing games. Nehemiah is not going to let things slide. He will always choose confrontation over everyone else's comfort. He is without question an 8 on the Enneagram. Okay, anybody familiar with the Enneagram? This dude is what they call a challenger. Just watch him in action, okay? When it comes to the house of God, what did he do? He threw Tobiah out and he put the right people back in. Verse 8, he said, "I was greatly displeased, and I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room." Okay, this is the angry wife who has locked the front door, who's changed all the locks on the house, and is now standing on the balcony throwing her husband's stuff into the front yard, right? That's what Nehemiah was doing. He took all of his household goods and he threw it out of the room. He didn't let it slide. He didn't let it continue. He did not turn a blind eye to what was happening. Instead, he insisted that we do the right thing. When it came to ignoring the Sabbath, things got a little more intense. He said in verse 19, "I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened again until the Sabbath was over." Then we read verses 20 and 21. "Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, 'Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you.'" And what do you know? From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. This is the guy who knows how to generate change. He knows how to get results. He doesn't let things slide. He doesn't turn a blind eye. He insists on taking a stand for what is right, and he insists that the people do the right thing. When it came to marrying women that they weren't supposed to marry, things got a little bit more intense. Again, not going to let it slide, not turning a blind eye. Verse 25, he says, I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. But this dude Nehemiah, he literally called curses down on them. He beat them, and apparently he may have even scalped them. Some of you ladies right now are thinking to yourself, I wish there had been a godly man like that around when I was married to my ex, right? But because you know that if there had been a godly man to confront him and maybe even whip him into shape, you might still be married and your family might still be restored and generations might still be changed. The truth is, we may not like a guy like Nehemiah, but we need a guy like Nehemiah. Now, personally, he crossed lines that I can't cross, but he was the governor, and the governor can get away with things that the preacher could never get away with. But when you put a guy like Nehemiah in charge, I promise you this, some people are going to love him, and some people are going to hate him. Some people are going to hate him, and they're going to complain about how he does the job, rather than focusing on the results that he gets as he does the job. And so they'll say things like, well, Nehemiah didn't have to be so mean to poor Tobiah. I mean, he threw all his stuff out of the room. What a jerk. They'll say things like, Nehemiah didn't have to threaten to arrest those merchants. I mean, they're just trying to make a living and provide for their family. Why was he so hard on them? Say things like, Nehemiah didn't have to beat those guys and pull out their hair. He is such a bully. That's what a lot of people would say. And I guess if that's the way you feel, then you could say the same exact thing about Jesus. That when Jesus rolled up into the temple one day and he saw people who were selling animal sacrifices at exorbitant prices, so high that poor people couldn't even buy sacrifices so that they could worship in the temple. You could say about Jesus, he could have asked the merchants to leave or commanded the merchants to leave. He didn't have to flip over their tables and he didn't have to drive them out with a whip. But he did. And so say what you want to say about Nehemiah. But maybe the world is going woke because the leaders in the church are also going woke. Maybe, just maybe, the church looks a lot like the world because leaders in the church have gotten soft. And for some of you men, maybe the reason that you get away with it is because you don't have a godly man in your life who won't let you get away with it. You surround yourself with soft people and people who tell you what you want to hear rather than telling you what you need to hear. And so for all those people who are really serious about changing their life, for all those men out there who really do want to change their legacy, for all of those men who are sick and tired of seeing how sin has led them to suffer and they want something better for their kids and for their grandkids, that you want sin patterns to stop and you want to change future generations in your family, if you want to break old patterns and start new patterns, you need to invite a man like Nehemiah into your life. And even better than that, you need to invite the Lord Jesus Christ into your life. But because those two men will do two things for you. They will call you out and they will hold you accountable for the life that God has called you to live. You need a man who doesn't just say, I'm not going to let it slide. You also need a man in your life who understands your history and they know how you struggle. They will call you out. They will challenge the way you're thinking, and they will help change your life. And so I want you to think back about your history for a minute. Not just the history in your life, but also the history in your family. I'm not saying that alcohol is wrong for everyone. But if there is a genetic predisposition in your family, it may be wrong for you. Alcohol may not create a problem in your life. But what if it skips a generation and it ends up ruining one of your kids' lives? Little warning about the issue of alcohol. Statistics vary depending on who you read, but most people agree that either 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 people who take a drink end up developing some kind of drinking problem. Another warning, what we also know is that whatever parents do in moderation, their children almost always do in excess. And so I would just challenge you today to know your family and do whatever you need to do to protect your family. The reason that we have Celebrate Recovery here is because we've seen a lot of people who have struggled with a lot of problems because of the alcohol issue. How about your marriage? I'm not saying that everyone needs to be in marriage counseling. But I am saying that if your parents got divorced and her parents got divorced, I promise you this, you've never seen a healthy marriage. And so if you want to break the pattern in your family, and if you want to start new patterns, you may have to do work on your marriage that other couples don't have to do on their marriage. If growing up you were abused, did you know that you are 6 times more likely to abuse your children because you were abused by your parents? It's not a guarantee that it will happen, but it is far more likely to happen. It's a pattern that often continues from one generation into the next. If your dad looked at pornography and he gave you pornography, that's a sin pattern that he started, and it's a sin pattern that you need to break. If your parents struggled with debt and money and credit cards, it's highly likely that you're going to struggle with debt and money and credit cards. And you don't just need a budget. You need a man like Nehemiah who is going to force you to live according to that budget. This is the beauty of biblical community. We help one another learn from our history so that we do not continue to repeat our history. Nehemiah did not just confront the people. He did everything he could to help correct the people. Specifically in verse 25, he said, I made them take an oath in God's name. And so I don't want to make you take an oath, but I want to challenge you to take an oath. It's how I want to end this series. It's how I want to end our entire study in the book of Nehemiah, by helping people who truly want to change, help them experience the kind of change that they want to see in their life, the change that God wants to see in their life. And so I want to invite everyone in the room at this time to stand. I'm going to put a declaration on the side screens. You don't have to read it aloud. If you want to continue in the same suffering and the same sin, just stand there silently. But for the rest of us who would love to see God change our lives and change our families for generations to come, let's read this together. God, I want to be like your perfect son, Jesus. I want my life to look like his life. I have to confess that there are things in my past that I do not want to be a part of my future. These things have been a part of my family, of my life, and a part of my family, but I want this pattern to come to an end in my generation. I want to break old patterns, and I want to start new patterns. God, for the sake of my kids and my grandkids, I ask for your help. I know Jesus has forgiven me, but I don't just want to be forgiven. I want to be free. So God, today I am declaring Galatians 5:1 over my family. It is for freedom that Christ has set me free. Help me to stand firm then, and do not let me be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. I ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, if we take that declaration seriously, we're not just seeing changes in our own lives. We're talking about seeing changes for generations to come. That's way more than just making a difference. That's what it looks like to truly leave a legacy. That's what Nehemiah did with his life while he lived in the city of Jerusalem. And that's how we should be living our lives as we carry them out here in Ocean Springs, out in Harrison County, and really all along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It's not just an opportunity to change our families. This is an opportunity for us to change generations on the entire Gulf Coast for many years to come. Let me pray for us. God, as we reflect on our entire study of the book of Nehemiah, we thank you so much for the lessons that we've learned. God, in some ways it's sad to look at this book and to see so clearly that we haven't really learned from our past. And so we continue to repeat the mistakes of our past. God, I pray that you would take the lessons that we've learned, and I pray, God, that you might lead us to take some courageous steps. I pray, God, that we would not just live on mission with you, but, God, where we look at our lives and we see generational sin patterns continue, God, I pray that we might invite godly men and godly women into our lives who will not let things slide, but who will always challenge us and who will always correct our thinking. And, God, that as a biblical community, we might be able to live life the way you intended for your people to live together, and that we might see radical change for generations to come. God, I know and I believe that your plan for our life is a good, pleasing, and perfect plan, and I so want your people to walk in that. I want to walk in that. I want my family to experience that. And so, God, help us as we move forward to be humble enough and courageous enough to invite godly people to help us in the journey called life. I pray it all in Jesus' name.